Hello, everybody. Bonjour. So happy to join you today. Thank you for inviting me. So as Jonathan mentioned, one of the things we have been doing is offering tools for emotional intelligence and mindfulness in organizations around the world. And this program, this curriculum really began at Google, where I was an employee myself for a number of years. So maybe I'll begin by telling you the story of why this set of tools has become useful at places like Google, how it's spread around the world. I want to share some outcome metrics with you because you are in a business school, and it's always helpful to understand kind of the case studies and the outcomes, the benefits of these things, both for individuals, but of course for organizations, also in terms of things like the bottom line. And then maybe share with you a little bit of the actual tools, the actual experiences and skill building exercises that we do, a very, very small taste of that, and then maybe some time for questions and answers. I would love for this to be a conversation. We're a small enough group in the room today. And for those of you that are watching this by video, I hope also this will give you a sense of what this initiative is and then answer some of your questions. So why, I guess the first question is really why this now? Why this now? Why this set of tools now? The way I like to think about it is in terms of our own lives. So if you think of yourself as an individual, if you think of a Google employee who faces similar demands that you face, it may be the case that the complexity in life that you may be experiencing, some of the uncertainties of life, some of the demands in life are increasing. So how many of you, I can see you in the room, how many of you would say that the demands, the complexity, the uncertainty of life is increasing? Can you raise your hand? So that is everybody in the room. Now, here's the second question. How many of you would say that your capacity to meet that rising demand is increasing at the same rate? Raise your hand. That's nobody. Oh, one person in the room. Two people. Congratulations. Well done. That's very good. But for most people in today's, especially business environments, and especially in high growth, hyper growth companies such as Google, it's very hard to keep up with the demands and the complexity, with the pace, the intensity, the uncertainty. Sometimes this has been described as the VUCA world, VUCA, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The VUCA world. This is something that is commonly faced, I think, by people in high performance, high growth organizations. And so in that environment, the question becomes, what allows us to not only be effective, but to remain effective? When the pace is always high, when the demands are always high, when the complexity is ever increasing, how is it possible to then sustain well-being and high performance? So that was the fundamental question that we confronted at Google. So a little bit about my background. I am a psychologist by training. However, I spent almost 20 years in industry, the first 10 years in investment banking at JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America, and then I switched sectors and I went over to eBay. I was always a specialist in the field of learning, leadership, and organization development. So at eBay, I went to be the head of global learning for the company. This was around 2007. Right when the global financial crisis was hitting. So a time of great uncertainty and volatility. And then eventually a couple of years later, I went over to Google, where I was the head of executive education for the company, which means that I was responsible for leadership development for the senior leaders at Google, directors, vice presidents, senior vice presidents, and above. So I really had a close look firsthand at some of the challenges and some of the necessary skills to lead and perform effectively within these environments in times of great volatility and uncertainty. So when a company like Google and in its earlier days, eBay has that hockey stick effect, that kind of up and to the right growth trajectory. It's very demanding on the people who work there, as you can imagine. Actually, some of you might be facing similar situations in your own work. So again, what are the set of skills that allow people to navigate this VUCA world, this experience of ever increasing demands and complexity? Well, at Google, one of the things that we realized is that there has to be a way to understand this from a scientific perspective. Of course, it being Google, we were very interested in sort of scientific, data-backed solutions to things, evidence-based solutions. And especially here, we're talking about human development and performance. So what's a good scientific way to really understand human performance? Well, one place you look is the brain. What happens in our brains and our bodies, of course, but we began with the brain. What happens in our brains when we are trying to sharpen our focus, when we're trying to perform optimally from a cognitive perspective, when we're trying to do things like manage stress? What parts of our brain are activated, and how can we activate those and sustain those in this type of environment? And that's really where our program derives from, which is the basis of neuroscience. It's a neuroscience of sort of optimal performance and well-being. That's what we were interested in. And what we came to learn is that there is a body of work out there focused on things like emotional intelligence that actually are related to neuroscience. So emotional intelligence, though it's a psychological and behavioral construct, there's actually real correlates to brain performance. And so if we could only get to the brain hacking parts of this, if we can only get to the ways that we can train our brains to develop useful mental habits to enable things like emotional intelligence, we know that it helps people not only manage stress, but manage teams effectively and be effective leaders. All of the outcome research seems to indicate that. So that was the core problem set. And what I'd like to do now is just do a very brief presentation to you. I want to show you a little bit of data about how we went about creating this curriculum, and then I'll kind of come back to kind of just talking about it. But I'm going to present now briefly because I really want you to kind of have an understanding of what I'm talking about here. So can you all see my screen here? Jonathan, can they see the presentation? Jonathan? Yeah? Is that on the screen?
No. No, not yet.
No? Okay. You're presenting all monitors. Is that not showing my screen?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, if that does not work, then I will just present. Let's try that. No?
No.
One more time. Otherwise, I will just talk through it. It says you're presenting all monitors. You should be sharing even if the presenting status bar doesn't show. No? Okay. Then I'll just speak to it. So essentially what we're talking about here are science-based mental skills for optimal performance and well-being. Science-based mental skills. What are these science-based mental skills? Like I said, they have to do with emotional intelligence, which is the ability to become aware of oneself, to manage oneself in terms of your thoughts and emotions, to become aware, to develop social awareness, and to effect relationship management. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and then relationship management. Sounds all good and fine. That's the way it's been defined. The outcomes, when you're able to effectively do that, seem to be very positive. But the core problem set is, how do you create that as a set of skills that are trainable in people? So how do you operationalize emotional intelligence? So the answer that we found was one of the core skills, one of the core capacities in terms of emotional intelligence was mindfulness. And by mindfulness, what we were really talking about there was the ability to go from a state of distraction, a state of autopilot, as we call it, to a state of awareness, of focus, of mental clarity. Because what we know actually from neuroscience is that the brain, in its default state, in its natural state, more often than not is distracted. There's a study out of Harvard that tells us that roughly 47% of the time, our mind is not focused. That they found that people, 47% of the time, did not have their mental focus on the task they were performing while they were performing it. And often it's much higher than 47% of the time. And we actually know from a neuroscience perspective that if we put you in the curriculum, we actually show the neural kind of real-time brain neural network firing. As you're sitting there right now listening to me, in this very moment, in your resting state, your brain is kind of firing, or electrical signals are going across your brain. And about half the time, you won't be paying attention to me. You'll be thinking about something else. You may be pulled to your device. That's a natural state for human beings, actually. So don't feel bad. That's totally natural. But if that's the natural state, in an environment, especially where we have tons of distraction, how do we maintain focus and mental clarity? Well, again, what we know is from research that when you're able to do certain types of mental training, such as mindfulness training, which is training your focus, training your attention, you actually switch those neural networks that are firing from the distracted networks, what's called the default mode network in your brain, to more of the direct attention network in your brain. It activates certain neural centers in your brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and certain other areas. And to cruciate the insula, other brain structures start to fire. And these are much more about mental clarity, mental focus, perceptual awareness, rather than kind of jumping from thing to thing. So you can actually train your brain. And in fact, research has found that we know that you can train your brain because research has found two unique things. One is that you can actually grow gray matter in these areas of the brain. And I would show you this on the brain slide that I have, but I can't seem to present. But that you can actually grow gray matter in your brain in these areas that are associated with focus. So I'll try one more time. Is that showing? Do you see a brain or no? You just see me? Okay. I'm imagining it's just me. Oh, it's showing? Okay, good, good. Okay, good. So I'll show you this now. So like I said, science-based mental skills is how we went about doing this. And this was developed at Google when I was at Google because we were really concerned. And so the curriculum we developed was called Search, like Google Search, you know, inside yourself though. And eventually, I'll talk about it later on, we spun off a separate nonprofit, which is what I lead today, which is the Leadership Institute, the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. But the curriculum at Google is called Search Inside Yourself, SIY. Because as I mentioned, we know that in these different parts of the brain, whether it's the prefrontal cortex that is tasked with attention and the executive function of decision making, certain areas also there in the frontal lobe that are dedicated to positive emotion, areas deeper in the brain, such as the hippocampus, that are responsible for learning and memory and emotional balance and regulation, gating emotions. Those areas too are affected by certain types of mental skills training. Your stress response, quieting the stress response, and even developing compassion and empathy and perspective taking. All of these areas in the brain show changes when you're able to train these mental skills. And when I say changes, I mean both they either grow denser gray matter, so they actually grow neural networks. If you look over 8 weeks, for example, in the learning and memory area or the attention area in the prefrontal cortex, you'll see cortical thickening. you'll see thickening of the gray matter once you start to train these skills. The best analogy for this is like a muscle, right? If you went to the gym and you lifted barbells a lot, you would grow your muscle. Well, similarly in the brain, when you exercise your neural networks over time, fairly consistently in a certain way, you actually grow gray matter in the brain. The other thing that happens in the brain is the conversation between the neural networks gets clearer and faster. So for example, the stress response, the ability to manage stress and to quiet down the stress response when you're triggered by a stressful situation can actually quiet down the parts of your brain that are responsible for positive emotions, for attention. The parts of the prefrontal cortex can actually send a signal to the stress response areas and tell them to down-regulate, is the technical term, or to quiet down. Fascinating, right? So really for us then, the question becomes, what are these skills? How do you train these mental skills? And so that's the curriculum we developed. We'll try these in a moment, but I just also want to share some outcomes with you. So really, the structure of what I'm talking about is the skills are mental training. We roughly call these mindfulness skills. They're attention training, awareness training, empathy, and social awareness skills. They're based on neuroscience and they enable emotional intelligence. And that essentially is the recipe for the SIY curriculum, as you see here. We've been running this program at Google and in many other globally influential companies for the last 10 years in over 30 countries. And so you can also see we've run these programs in sector diverse organizations, including universities, but also many other types of industries from manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, tech, etc. Now, importantly, when we had this, and by the way, when we rolled this program out at Google, it became wildly popular. It would fill within like 10 seconds of the release of the new course, and it still is perhaps the most popular program at Google and also the most highly rated because it was tremendously helpful for people to have these skills. And it was based on science. It wasn't just soft skills training, right? It was actually useful mental habits that were based on science. And they were so useful that one of the things that Google likes to do is open source or at least publish and make available their tools in the people space, in the culture space. So about 6-7 years ago, we had a conversation with my then boss, who was the head of HR at Google, and said, look, this is so helpful. Many other organizations are going to find this helpful. Perhaps what we should do is we should offer this to other organizations. Maybe we should create a separate nonprofit organization, a .org. Let's call it the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, or SILY for short, SIYLI, SILY is what we call ourselves. And let's spin off from Google, function as an independent nonprofit, and offer this to other organizations, which is Google's, mindfulness and emotional intelligence curriculum. And so that's what we have done today. One of the things we know is that our participants, and we have over 50,000 people now who have gone through these experiences in all these organizations, we know that it helps with their focus. So we do pre-post measures, and we know that people see double-digit increases here, as you see, in their ability to prioritize and to also know when they're distracted and then to bring back their attention to the task at hand. We know it improves their performance, particularly with regard to resilience, that when dealing with difficult situations, they're able to focus on potential opportunities rather than getting stuck on a very challenging situation, and then bounce back after the emotionally challenging situations. In terms of leadership, we also know that in terms of conflict, people with these skills are able to kind of negotiate conflict differently because they're able to understand other perspectives and not just be so completely engrossed in their own. In other words, as you see in the second bar graph there, they're able to pause before reacting. We have a case study at one of our biggest clients, which is SAP, which is, as you may know, a global software manufacturer based in Germany, but it's a global company. And on all of these indices of performance, engagement, and wellness, you can see that there are significant increases 4 weeks after our programming and then 6 months afterwards. And here's what's really interesting. if you look at that first metric, well-being, SAP knows that for every 1 percentage point increase in employee reported wellness, there is roughly 85 to 95 million euros in operating profit increases for every 1 percentage point increase in overall employee wellness. Now that's well published. You can look up, you can Google that. They published that study. And also in terms of employee engagement, which many of you know about or perhaps will learn about. Employee engagement is a measure of people's motivation, judged by their ability to give what's called discretionary effort, the ability to kind of give everything to your role and have both a rational and an emotional commitment to your job. So that's called employee engagement, and it is a core business metric, actually. It really does show a lot of productivity and eventually performance outcomes for organizations. Every 1 percentage point increase in employee engagement leads to about 50 to 60 million euros in operating profit for SAP. So they know that. So you could see that if you take well-being, if you take employee engagement, you regress them against operating profit, you're going to have some pretty good outcomes. Anyway, this is just a case study. And then you also see these other areas: communication, collaboration, relationship, creativity, decreases in stress, increases in focus. These are all very, very beneficial for employees in highly demanding, high performance environments. So we have currently now 44 trained employees at SAP who become certified in the SIY curriculum, and now are offering this. Every year they offer this to over 3,000 employees at SAP, our curriculum. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're talking about here when we talk about the outcomes. I'm going to stop presenting and come back to my view here, because what I'd like to move to now is just share a little bit of the experience of these things. So I've talked about it. I've sort of offered some definitions. So what are we actually talking about here? What are these mental skills? Let's give you an experience of that, then we'll pause for questions. So when we talk about training our focus, what we're talking about is training our attention, right? Attention, many people have said attention is a scarce resource, and that we are in an attention economy, that so many of the things in our current lives, in this contemporary culture, that often come through here are designed to capture our attention and to keep it, right? So in that type of environment, how do you train your attention? The answer is simple, but not easy. Direct your full undivided attention to a single object of focus and keep it there. That's how you train focus. It's very simple, but it's not easy, because I'm going to invite you to do that with me in a second. Why is it not easy? You actually know the answer, because your attention will move away from that object of focus roughly, you remember the answer to this one? 47% of the time. Before I tell people about that Harvard study, I ask the question, how often do you think your attention moves away from whatever it is that you're focusing on in the moment? People usually say 80%, 90% of the time. So I think the answer is variable for all of us, but in this Harvard study of several thousand people, they found that it was roughly 47% of the time on average. Microsoft did another study about attention over time, and they found that our attention has dropped roughly 4 seconds from what it was in 2010, I believe it was, from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. So in terms of time, roughly every 8 seconds, our mind kind of wanders, right? Which is 1 second less than a goldfish spends when they're focused on a piece of food. So we're doing worse than goldfish. So this is why it's really important to train our attention. So I'm going to invite you to do that for a second, and then we can open it up for questions and conversation. So there are some age-old techniques for this, and they derive from many traditions, both Eastern and Western. But what we're really interested in is what set of tools and exercises activates the part of our brain that's responsible for focus. Again, because we're science-based and secular. So In the past, this has sometimes been described as meditation. It has been described as prayer. Whatever, doesn't matter. What we're going to be doing is evidence-based, science-based mental skills training. And we're going to do this specific one that's about focus. The way we'll do this, I will invite you, and I'll give you some guidance on this, is to train our focus on our breath. Train our focus on our breath. So remember earlier I said to train your focus, you need one object of attention, right? And you need to bring your full undivided attention to that object of attention. I invite us to use our breath. In this curriculum, we use our breathing because, first of all, we assume you're all breathing. And if you're not, you should please, let someone know. Second of all, your breath is always available to you, right? And third of all, you don't need to believe in anything to train your attention on your breathing. So let's try this. So it is often helpful to sit in a way that is comfortable, alert, but relaxed at the same time. Whatever that means for you, alert but relaxed. If you like, you can close your eyes. If not, we would just invite you to sort of gently direct your gaze downward, soften the visual field, just so that there's not too much input, because we're going to be training our attention. And just begin by noticing kind of your own body, your own experience of sitting there. And then gradually bring your attention to your breathing. Here now, in training our focus, I would invite you to bring your full, undivided attention to the experience of the air coming in and out of your body. The sensations of the in-breath and the out-breath. Just noticing this full cycle of breathing. Directing your full, undivided attention in a firm but gentle way to this experience of breathing. The sensations of the in-breath and then the out-breath. And this cycle again, in-breaths and out-breaths. Focusing your attention on the breath, resting your attention on the breath. And let's continue on this for a few moments here. Focused attention on the breath. It may be natural for your mind to wander away. We know that that happens half of the time or more. If your mind has wandered from your breath, if your attention has wandered, if you're noticing your attention has wandered, returning your full undivided attention to the experience of the breath. The mind wanders, attention moves away, return the attention to the breath. Over and over again, if the attention wanders, return attention to breath. And as we draw this exercise to a close, just taking 3 slightly deeper breaths at your own pace. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and rejoin the larger group. Well, thank you for your attention. That was the first exercise. That was a attention training exercise. Simple, but not easy, right? I don't know if how many of you found your minds wandering. Perhaps some of you fell asleep. If anyone fell asleep, there is a statistically powerful scientific explanation for that. It means that you're probably very tired. We don't often pause in this way other than when our head hits the pillow at night. So our bodies sometimes go into that mode. And actually, after about a minute of this, you're starting to bring online what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that's responsible for quieting down. So there is an effect in which by training your focus and using breath, you're actually stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, the stress system. It's the opposite of that. It's the quieting system, sometimes called rest and digest system. But other than the parasympathetic nervous system, one of the things you were doing right there in those moments where your attention was squarely focused on the sensation of air coming in and out was you're activating the focus center of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. So if I was to put you in a brain scanner, in those moments in which you could direct your full attention to your breath, you would see this part of your brain lighting up as opposed to all of these lateral areas, which is the default mode. The scientific way to describe that is you are activating the direct attention network in your brain as opposed to resting in the default state, the default mode network, right? So we literally are neural network switching. That's what we were doing. Strange as it sounds, simple as it sounds, that's actually what was happening in your brain. So I might pause there because I've been talking for a while and there may be questions. And I just want to share with you that this curriculum that we're talking about actually is run over a 16-hour period, usually 8 weeks, over time, or, an hour a week, or we can do them in 2 full days. That's sometimes we just kind of put all 2 8-hour days. But the reason we do that is because the very exercises and skill building that you experience there take a while to not only learn about, but to habituate. So our experience is that in order to develop effective mindfulness and emotional intelligence skills, it takes about 16 hours to instantiate and habituate. So that because this is all wonderful, but if you don't exercise these skills, you won't enjoy the benefits. It's like brushing your teeth. Science says brushing our teeth is a good idea. If you try brushing your teeth once, it may feel good and it may have a benefit, but unless you do it on a regular basis, you're not going to enjoy the benefits. Okay? So similarly, training our brain in this way for focus, for mental clarity, for emotional balance and intelligence requires sort of ongoing practice. And that's why we have it for 16 hours. And you saw some of those outcomes that we saw. So let me pause there and see if there is any questions or anything you wish to further discuss or learn about.
I'd just like to know regarding coffee. We're used to grabbing coffee in the morning, then the day goes on, it gets stressful. If I want to refocus, take a moment to refocus just like we did right now, with caffeine and everything like that, I'm guessing that it's going to be harder because our mind will be a little going faster than usual. So
one thing that this really relates to is what's called the intradian rhythm. So some of you might have heard of the circadian rhythm, which happens day after day, like in the course of a full day, like when you have peaks and valleys of energy. Well, intradian rhythm is within periods of the day. And one of the things that we've learned scientifically is that the human energy and the capacity for focus and performance lasts about 90 minutes max. And then you see serious drop-offs in performance. And so that's usually when we hit ourselves with caffeine, right? Because caffeine's a stimulant and it gets us performing again, except that there's a reason that our performance dips, because our bodies and our minds need a break, actually. Right? So even though we can caffeinate, it doesn't put us back at that sort of same performance peak that we were at before. It's a little bit lower. So the answer is yes, you can caffeinate and sort of power through, but it's not as optimal as if you even took like a 3 to 5 minute break, which means getting up from where you're sitting or from the task you're doing and just going, making yourself some coffee or tea, even breaking away and then coming back is really critical. Also, when you do these types of skills like we just did, like if you can take a break and sit someplace where you're not using your kind of focused attention brain, your cognitive brain, but maybe talking to a colleague, stepping outside the building and just taking some fresh air, or even doing some of these mindfulness related skills, those also reboot your attention and your energy, and can be an alternative to caffeine, or it can co-occur. But what I would say is just be very aware of humans are not meant to just kind of perform like machines for an 8-hour basis straight. These breaks, these rhythms, they're peaks and valleys throughout your day. They're called intradian rhythms, within day rhythms, and they last about 90 minutes. So next time you're in a meeting or you're busy doing a project, after every 60 to 90 minutes, take a 3 to 5 minute break or longer, up to 10 or 15 minute break if you can, and you'll see that it'll have a different effect.
Okay. Maybe I just have one question of clarification. Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between mindfulness and emotional intelligence?
Yes. Well, from our learnings, mindfulness operationalizes emotional intelligence. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, essentially we talk about self-awareness and self-management, and then we talk about social awareness and relationship management. So mindfulness is, very briefly, the movement from being distracted and on autopilot, from that distracted state, to being aware. It actually trains your focus, it trains your awareness and your perceptual skills of yourself and of other people. And so that is the foundation on which emotional intelligence is built. That is attention and awareness. And attention and awareness are often thought about in this very abstract way, but there's actually ways that you can train your attention, like we just did for 3-4 minutes there. And there's ways you can train your awareness, which is more of a perceptual skill, kind of more of a monitoring or observational skill. We didn't do that today because we haven't had time, right? Remember, this is a 16-hour curriculum, right? But when you train attention and awareness, that also leads you to developing empathy and even compassion, which are the core components of the emotional intelligence skills that we're talking about. When you train attention and awareness, you develop self-awareness, right? When you train attention and awareness, you're able to self-manage because you're aware of the emotion you're having, and then you know how to work with it and respond skillfully. Similarly, when you train attention and awareness, and that leads to empathy and compassion, you start to understand the perspectives of another person, so developing social awareness. And then based on that awareness, you're able to respond skillfully socially, which leads to effective relationship management. So fundamentally, mindfulness is the foundation on which emotional intelligence rests.
Hi, Rich. I'm Nicolas Gomez. I'm a student at University of Montréal. And so you said that, so the brain is always, like, most of the time, well, not most of the time, but it's on autopilot. Do you think that give attention to things or being conscious, it's like it can be also our natural mode?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that roughly half the time we're distracted, the other half of the time we're focused and we're aware, and so I do think it is a human capacity we all have, and that at various points during our day we exercise that capacity. but that increasingly it's a capacity we have to exercise intentionally. Like we have to do it deliberately. We have to like remember that we're distracted and remember that we can kind of be focused and aware. Because I think there's so many things in our environment that kind of pull us into a state of distraction. And so it's important to be aware when you are distracted. By the way, that's the important thing to note here. Maybe in the exercise that you did, you had that experience as well, which is that your mind would naturally wander, right? Our minds naturally wander. It's not about shutting down all thought and just being this conscious being that's floating, you know, in the air. It's about knowing that we're distracted when we're distracted, and then being able to return to a state of focus and openness and mental balance and emotional balance when we find ourselves distracted. I mean, I'll give you an example. If in my country, all I have to do is open the newspaper each morning, and, you know, in certain areas of leadership in my country, I sort of read it and I get completely, you know, like emotionally charged and upset and things like this. And I realize, okay, that's happening. And it's okay that that happens. I have good reason to feel that way. And maybe it's time for me to, you know, like step away and focus on something else. And just knowing that human experience is awareness is a state. It's a state. Distraction is a state, right? It's not a trait. It's not this enduring quality that you're doomed to. It's a state. When you're in a distracted state, how can you become aware of that and move to a state of focus? How can you develop a state of awareness to become aware of your own experience and that of others? These are things that you actually have control over. We actually have control over this, and we have the capacity to develop this skill, which is mindfulness, but also we sometimes call it response flexibility. Response flexibility. The ability to be agile in the face of challenges, right? This is a capacity we all have. It resides in our brains and in our bodies, and we can actually bring it forward with intentional exercise and practice. And that's the heart of the SIY offering, is that mental and emotional skills, like all skills, are trainable. And so what we want to do is provide the tools to help people train them. You can train awareness. You can train states of consciousness. We have them naturally. You can enhance them.